Good morning, welcome to Media Monitor, the show that analyzes news, media locally and abroad. My name is Bongi Gwala, in for Peter Ndoro today. Thank you for joining us this morning. Now let's take a look at what you can look forward to this hour. We take a look at the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission through how it was covered in the media and ask what was the role of the media during the TRC. We further unpack the media ethics and integrity in the way the TRC was depicted in the press at the time the commission was ongoing. Before we delve into our discussion today, let's take a look at the Sunday newspaper headlines. The Sunday Times this morning leads with a story on how Home Affairs Minister Malusi Gigaba is mounting a fight back, daring his detractors to charge him with perjury for lying under oath and calling South Africa's richest family, the Oppenheimers, dishonest liars. The City Press carries a story about the National Prosecuting Authority being wrecked by a supposed sex tape scandal after claims of a video allegedly showing acting National Director Silas Raimate entraced with a security guard has come to light. The scandal comes as the race to become the National Director of Public Prosecutions heats up this week with a shortlisting process and interviews of identified candidates beginning tomorrow. The Sunday Independent leads with a story about the dispute over late rapper Jabulani Tsambo, better known as WHP's burial. The bitter dispute was over where the rapper's final resting place would be. The rapper's widow, Lerato Sengadi, argued that her husband's wish had been to be buried at West Park Cemetery in Johannesburg. However, the judge ruled that the provincial official funeral go ahead as planned in Mahikeng. The Sunday Tribune runs with a story about the land deal between hotel magnate Saul Kesner and the then Transkei government, now the Eastern Cape, to lease the land for the resort. The agreement stipulated community members living on the land be evicted, making way for the building of the casino and other facilities. Residents from the Umgungundlovu area received news that they had got their land back and were the new landlords of the Wild Coast Sun. The Weekend Argus leads with a story on how the former mayor of Cape Town, Patricia de Lille, could start a new political party with the loyalists who have severed ties with the DA and the city ahead of next year's elections. Eswatini's Sunday Observer carries a story about popular gospel singer and newly elected Nkilongo Member of Parliament Timothy Miene, who is being investigated by police over an incident in which a schoolgirl allegedly jumped off his vehicle, injuring herself in the process. The front page of Nigeria's Daily Trust runs with the story on how religious leaders want to end Shiite army clashes. Experts and religious clerics have expressed worries over the recent series of violent confrontations between members of the Islamic movement in Nigeria, popularly known as Shiites, and the security forces, advocating measures to be taken to prevent the situation from getting out of hand. Well, the 28th of October marked the 20th anniversary since the chairperson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Emeritus Archbishop Desmond Tutu, handed over the final commission report to former President Nelson Mandela. The TRC was set up by the government of national unity led by Nelson Mandela soon after the country's first democratic elections in 1994. It was established to be a restorative body that would help deal with what happened during the apartheid era, when violence and human rights abuses were perpetrated by the apartheid government, mainly against the blacks. The commission would help promote peace and reconciliation. Well, a question for us now is, what was the role of the media during the TRC and the years after, and maybe even during the apartheid era? To help us answer these questions, we are joined by Amina Frence from IAJ and political analyst, of course, Melo here in the studio with me. We will then go to that. But first, let's take a look at this insert.
Working in mainline television, and as I said earlier, it was the best time to be in television. At the startup of this magic box. It was a wonderful time to be in television. It was the only time to be in television. Those other factors never entered my head for a moment. We were out to make programs to the very best of our capability, and I believe that we produced world-class programs in their own right. So those sort of political factors did not enter my mind at all. I am not a political animal.
Is it so that even if one accepts that, and I accept it for the moment, for purposes of being fair to you, you were conscious that the programs that you were producing were one-sided, projecting the viewpoint of the South African regime's military establishment, and carrying on and actually carrying across to the South African public that they are fighting a faceless threat in the form of a communist threat, a terrorist threat, without your programs actually revealing that the men and women who have been deployed on our borders were actually deployed to fight not foreigners, but nationals, men and women who were born and bred in this country in a war of liberation. Well, you know, it is not going to the record.
Well, once again, I must say that those factors did not occur to me.
All right, Don Briscoe there, a documentary maker, talking to Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza, who was the former TRC commissioner. Right, let me bring in my guest here. Melo Mkholejo is a media analyst. Good morning to you, Melo.
Morning, Bongi.
Thanks also, Amina, for coming through. Highly appreciated. Perhaps let me start with you. Before we even talk to what Don was talking about there and what Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza was trying to extract out of him, let's look at the TRC itself. Did it achieve what it had set out to achieve? There are varying views on that.
I think to a great extent. I think it was necessary at the time, and I suppose while the TRC was unfolding, it's a process well covered by the media, well covered, also well executed by our commissioners, including the Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. So I think the process was important. It had to be done. Maybe it was not 100% successful. Maybe it did not achieve everything it had, but I think it unearthed some of the atrocities, to a great extent, the atrocities perpetrated by the previous apartheid regime. So it has achieved a lot, I think, but I think it's not a finished business yet. I think people are still upset that perhaps there's not enough compensation for the loss, and that is sometimes very difficult to quantify. And now it has emerged that there are some people who are not so truthful on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there are calls to perhaps reopen some cases. There's a Timor Commission of Inquiry, as we know, 41 years later, the death of Ahmed Timor, thrown from the top floor of John Vorster Square. That inquiry is now being reopened, and some of the perpetrators have been found to be alive. So that case is being reopened. And I think given the success of that very long process of reopening that case to really hear the truth, I think other families will follow. Other families found closure, Melo, but many didn't. Do you think perhaps that the TRC opened up too many wounds and left them open like that, and too many people couldn't and didn't find closure?
For me, I think to properly understand and contextualize this notion of closure, you have to ask yourself, what is it exactly that you want to give back to the families, right? You want to give them some sort of material compensation, you want to give them back some sort of spiritual dignified or compensation and so on.
The truth is what people want.
And also even in notions of truth, right? So for me, I think the way I'd like to enter this discussion is looking at actually the founding act in Parliament that gave rise to the TRC, right? The Promotion of National Reconciliation and Unity Act of 1995, right? So if you look in that act, in the preamble, it says something very interesting, is that the Commission will be confined to acts that happened after 1 March 1960, all the way up to 1996 when the Constitution came into effect, right? So now that has a significant impact on the way we structure the narrative in discussing what actually happened in the history of South Africa. I feel that what that did essentially is that, and the way the TRC unfolded and subsequently the way the media covered it, is that it has robbed us of vocabulary to be able to understand our post-apartheid reality, right? Because one of the things that it has done there is that it has taken the notion of apartheid in itself, right, and individualized it to acts of certain individuals, pathologized their behavior, whether it be your Eugene de Koks, whether it be your voter persons and so on. But at no point was apartheid as a system actually on trial, if you can put it that way, right? So the mere fact that you've already confined yourself to that, it means that you've excluded all of that, right? And then that obviously starts to play itself out in the way the media covers it, right? So we can come and comment about the quantitative nature of whether the media actually spent enough hours covering the TRC, or the qualitative, or whether the media actually spent enough time covering the substantive issues that were addressed at the TRC. But one needs to take a step back and look at the methodological prospect of whether or not what the TRC sought to achieve would actually succeed at exactly what it is that you're driving towards, right? Because within that, if I can just, one last point, there's issues of land that have come up now, right? There's issues of Marikana and the whole mining system in the country, right? All of those issues flow out of this whole notion of apartheid, right? But it's almost like we've taken the TRC and narrowed it to some narrow thing of human rights violations.
I will ask then if the media was successful in highlighting those issues and those shortcomings of the TRC. But Amina, let me bring you in here. You know, the legitimacy of the TRC was questioned. No higher authority than P.W. Botha himself, who said, why subpoena me and not Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the IFP leader, for instance, who rejected the TRC outright? What are you hoping to get from me that you can't get from him? You know, statements like those. Was the media then successful in probing further and say, but you were the head of the state at that particular time during these atrocities? Were we successful as the media in doing that?
I think Mela brings up a very important point, and the question is it too late to really go back and really reopen and reset the terms of reference? I think it's a very important point that is brought up. You know, we can't put the media all in one basket. There are some members of the media who have questioned it. It has been written about, but probably not adequately. So whether the media has been successful in terms of answering that question, I think the media is guided by the terms of reference and the brief that we have. But I think on a whole, at the time I was at the SABC and I was part of a team, you know, an amazing team that covered the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think the media covered it very well. And also the follow-up in terms of making sure that the documentation is archived properly, it's in the National Archive, it's accessible to the people and so on. So I think from that point of view it was successful. They covered it professionally, ethically, and I think there are also a number of prizes that have been won by some of the people. And I must say some of the journalists who worked on it, on the Truth and Reconciliation, some of them suffered from burnout. The process was so intense over so many years, and there's always not enough time to attend to themselves. And I think some people ended up in hospital really needing counseling. Not a weakness, but I mean that is just the intensity of the process. In terms of the media speaking out at the TRC Commission, I think that was lacking. A few people came forward. For whatever reason, I'm not sure whether they haven't been approached or didn't see a reason for coming forward. So I think there are many untold stories still in the media of what has happened.
And, so the role of the media itself.
The role of the media then during the apartheid regime. I think we the media now as a whole, I think we have a lot to answer for. You know, those who worked on the other side, if you like. There were very few people who were not propagandists, let's put it that way. But it's difficult to lug the media all in one, you know, all in one basket, if you follow what I mean.
And the role, I mean, of particularly the Afrikaans media and the Afrikaans newspapers at that particular time is well documented. They understood that you know, the news of the day would be informed by the apartheid system, which controlled pretty much the political, economic, socio-economic relations in South Africa, and they had to press ahead with that narrative.
Yes, unfortunately and regrettably, the very institution that we're sitting in, you know, the building which is now called Radio Park, I think it used to be called the Piet Meyer building. He was the chief propagandist. And I don't know if one of his children was called Izan, which spells Nazi backwards. And where, so the apartheid ideology, was to some extent is inspired by National Socialism in Germany, where some of the Afrikaner students studied and became our so-called leaders in the apartheid regime. Yes, the Afrikaans and also the English papers, they towed the line, but there were some rebels, there were some people who spoke out, and they were rejected. Remember, there was this all-encompassing body called the Broederbond that controlled your life and your mission and your success in life. So there are lots of aspects, I think, that today's media, needs to interrogate in terms of the role that the media played then. I think a lot of it is known, but maybe I don't know how much of this is taught at journalism school, in the wake of fake news and the crisis that we find ourselves in, including the shrinking of the media environment and job losses, including at the SABC and so on. I think it's the kind of history that I think we need to familiarize ourselves with. We can't really move forward adequately if we don't know what we sold our souls for then, at least some of us.
Okay. All right, I'll come back to you, Melo. We've got to take a quick break. Melo Mahuleke is a media analyst, and of course, Amina Fransa here is from IAJ. This is the Media Monitor here on SABC News Channel 404.
It's being dubbed the most consequential US election in a generation. And while President Donald Trump is not on the ballot, his presence looms large.
The Democrats have become an angry, unhinged mob determined to get power by any means necessary.
A vote to determine who controls the House of Representatives and the Senate.
While they are distracting you with this fear-mongering, they're robbing you blind.
Can Democrats mount a credible challenge to take back control of Congress? Or will the president's base provide enough of a buffer to thwart a possible blue wave? November 6th is D-Day for Republicans and Democrats. The SABC Foreign Desk will bring you comprehensive coverage of election 2018. SABC News, independent and impartial.
Welcome back. While the TRC created a space where diverse and heartbreaking narratives of suffering emerged, it is equally significant to note the role that South African media played in helping reflect and mold public opinion about the Commission. Coverage of the TRC has been praised by its Deputy Chairperson Alex Borain, who said, I never fail to be amazed at the scope and extent of the coverage of the TRC by the media. The TRC obviously appreciates very much the coverage it enjoys in telling the truth about the past. Were there any shortcomings where journalists covering the TRC bend the truth slightly for propaganda? Could the media also be said to have been directly responsible for gross human rights violations, and to what extent were they responsible? In this segment, we are talking about media ethics and integrity. Before we delve deeper into this discussion, let's take a look at this insert where veteran journalist Jubi Mayed is in front of the TRC Commission, where she gives testimony on how journalists should seek the truth.
Since we have been sitting here listening to senior journalists with 20 years and more of experience, it's like even the establishment of the truth is it's a very difficult thing to do for a journalist based on what they were saying. So I'm interested in your thinking about the process towards the establishment of the truth. I might go to a minister, interview a minister and say, this is really the truth. This is what the minister said. So what's your view of how should journalists seek the truth?
Well, if a journalist is objective in his reporting, he's going to say it the way it has to be, regardless of the consequences. I know in some cases there may be the feeling that you You're a bit nervous about biting the hand that feeds you, as it were. But I don't know, as far as I'm concerned, the only thing a journalist has to do is to tell the truth. Journalists should feel free to do their jobs and not have to worry about who's watching me, you know, who's tapping my phone, who's going to do this, that, or the other to me if I write the story. They should feel free to do their jobs properly, conscientiously, and with truth always the first in mind.
And that's Juby Mayet there talking to Professor Hlengwe Mkhize, who was one of the commissioners at the TRC. Still with me here in the studio is Melo Makhuleko, who is a media analyst, and of course Amina Frenze is with the Institute for the Advancement of Journalism, a journalism training institute. Melo, let me start with you. Very powerful words there coming from Juby, who says that journalists should be free to be able to do their story. Free from any fear. You mustn't fear that your phone is going to be tapped at any given point, but also you must not even fear those who assign you to go and do a story, so that you tell the truth. How powerful is that?
No, absolutely. I mean, it speaks to the notion that of the type of society that we wish to create in South Africa, right? A society wherein people can be able to speak their minds and be able to speak truth to power, right? But then obviously that's not always possible because of certain constraints that the human being has, right? And those constraints can be responsibilities to family. Those constraints can be a deficiency in character and a lack of ethics, perhaps, right? And one of the things that has come up recently, obviously, is this notion of Stratcom and this whole apartheid-sponsored propaganda project, which was used to peddle certain stories about individuals in the media. And one of the victims of such stories was ostensibly Winnie Madikizela Mandela, right? So obviously now this feeds into this broader narrative that I'm talking about, of where we've taken this whole notion of apartheid and personalized it around certain individuals, right? Then that makes it very much possible for such propaganda campaigns to work, right? Because all you need to do is vilify certain individuals, run propaganda campaigns against them, and then from there on it sort of like distracts from the broader structural and systemic issues. So what she's saying in there is very much relevant and very powerful in terms of seeking truth. But then truth cannot only just be about individuals. Truth also needs to be structural, institutional, and whole systemic.
And Amina, was the media given an opportunity to do so during the TRC? Did it report fairly in terms of its role? Was the media ethical in its reporting? Was it beyond and above reproach? Or you get a sense that there is so much that the media could have said that happened during apartheid that it chose not to say?
Look, I think the media covered the TRC quite intensely, and a lot of it was covering it as it happens. And I must say there, I'm still astonished at the access and freedom that we, the media, had in terms of people's lives and people's pain and people's suffering. Them talking about it for the first time.
That was just the event itself, the TRC, but the role of the media generally, because the atrocities that were reported about, that came out in the TRC, were the atrocities that were committed during the apartheid regime and apartheid time, right?
Yes.
And the media played a critical role in adopting a particular agenda and a particular narrative. They had an opportunity to come to the TRC. They chose not. Institutions like the Afrikaans newspapers, for instance, as bodies, refused to come through, but individuals did. So did we miss an opportunity there to say we were unethical in our reporting?
It's probably very difficult it was probably very difficult to do that from their point of view. I think only those who believed that they were fair and believed that they covered it fairly under the circumstances came forward. That is why I said in the beginning, I think it was lacking, you know, the media in front of the TRC. That was lacking. It's almost like the tip of the iceberg. It hasn't been interrogated, and there are still media who need to answer for how they behaved and how they reported during the apartheid era. There's no doubt about that. So I think those stories are still the stories that are left untold.
Who should hold them accountable?
Yeah, but some of them are old, some of them have died, some of them have lost their memory. There's collective amnesia by some people, and there are some very brave individuals to say, I was part of it, and I realized that I was spouting propaganda. So it's a difficult question why they didn't come forward.
Yeah,
I think
because
it's
the
really
issue
a difficult
really
question.
is not so much about individual journalists. Yes, there were those who were rogue by nature, but it was the system itself.
The system, but to come back to what Miller has said, you know, it's a question of prosecuting the apartheid, the system, etc. It pervaded our whole lives. It dominated our whole lives. It controlled our whole lives, whether it is the church, whether it is where you live, it is where you go to school, it's where you may play in the park, it's where you may work, what work you can do. Although the apartheid legislation, the land issue that has been brought up, etc., it's very, very central to what apartheid was, and we're still reeling from the effects of it. So your central question, was the TRC effective? It had to happen, and I think there are other countries as well who have taken examples from how we dealt with our very conflicted past, and I think at the time it was necessary. But I think there's still untold stories. There are still untold stories, and maybe reopening and setting new terms of reference to really get to the root of where we are at the moment.
The term fake news and fake stories is a pretty new term in its nature, but the deed itself is very old.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that has brought it to the fore now is that what social media and the internet has done is that it has diffused and decentralized creation of news content and dissemination into public society, right? And what that has done is that it has upset power brokers within the system, and therefore that's why they've labeled it fake news, right? But then the notion itself, as you correctly point out, has existed. It's just that it was centralized around certain entities, and the apartheid government were masters in that type of propaganda, right? I mean, a specific example, if you look at, for example, Nationale Pers, Naspers as it is, right? Nationale Pers, I mean, owned publications such as your Rapport and your Beeld and so on, which are very much central to the apartheid project in terms of disseminating news and perspectives about apartheid, right? One of the things that has also come out now is, for example, the notion of Mnet. I mean, Mnet, the way it came about is that with the rise of television from 1976 and so on, is that the print media started going sort of certain decline in terms of advertising revenue, and the apartheid government sought it as a means to compensate, I suppose, Nationale Pers, which owned all of these print publications, to create a TV station in the form of Mnet to compensate them with some sort of advertising revenue, and that is how the story of Mnet began, and that is how it came about. So this obviously, had we properly understood such issues, it would have enlightened the conversation that had recently happened with ANN7 and how ANN7 sought to be created by government and so on. So for me, that's why I'm saying that there's a vocabulary missing within our public discourse, and that vocabulary, it was stolen from us, I suppose, in a way, by the way in which we structure the terms of reference of the TRC.
So the issue of unethical reporting and lack of integrity also is not new. We know that back in the day there would be spies who would be planted at the SABC and many other Afrikaans, particularly Afrikaans newspapers, and English as well. And recently we saw in the Sunday Times, for instance, the three reporters there who found themselves immersed in a web of lies and picking a particular narrative. Can the media, you know, extrapolate itself out of this and stand as a body that can be central in our developmental state that we in, and push the truth that will be believable ever again? Can we really get out of the mess that we are in as a media?
It is very difficult. In South Africa at the moment, we are really in a deeply entangled web with the lack of resources and the dispersal, you know, of the news or diffusion of the news through social media and so on. We are in an entanglement. If you just look at the to and fro's between, you know, on the print media side, TISO Black Star and independent media, and how did independent media come about through PIC funds and so on. So I think that will still go on for a while. How do we extract ourselves when we don't have resources? How do we extract ourselves if the mainstream media is dwindling, is diminishing, there are no resources, and it's left to perhaps outside funders to fund independent media, you know, independent, when I mean not independent media like the independent media group in South Africa, I mean investigative reporting, for example, those done by Amabongani and Daily Maverick and others, you know. Where does that funding come from? The funding comes from private money, the funding comes from outside. They are becoming mainstream in the absence of the present mainstream dwindling. How do we extract ourselves? If we don't have resources, it's very, very difficult. And the thing is, what impact does it have on our public? If our public is not informed, if our public is not supplied with qualitative truth-telling by the media, by the news, then who can tell them? And that is the question. But to go back to apartheid propaganda, it was a very powerful, well-resourced machine. You might remember the infamous Infogate scandal and all of the other structures that were set up to confuse the public and public opinion, not only locally but also internationally. And just recently, you know, with the so-called Guptagate and WikiLeaks, Guptagate leaks, etc. What has happened there? You know, with Bell Pottinger, etc. So there's always resources and money key to it. Who has the most resources? You know, will try and dominate the narrative. And I think that is very important. So therefore, public information, qualitative public information, qualitative truth-telling, you know, or just the truth-telling, not qualitative truth-telling, qualitative information, truth-telling is at the core of it. And so it's really a battle of the hearts and minds, and who has the most resources to do that, and how do you counter a terrible narrative, whether it is called fake news or anything else.
All right. My guest today, Amina Frense, who is with the Institute for the Advancement of Journalism, and Melo Mahule, who is a media analyst. We continue this discussion shortly here on Media Monitor.
Hanover Park is known to be a playground for gang members. Several pupils failed to attend classes due to gang shootings.
The impact of these gang wars is that we find that, you know, learners stay away from school.
There's a lot of disruptions, but yet I try to come every day to school so that I can have a better future.
As an education department, which is not our primary mandate to address crime, we do what we can to ensure that our learners and teachers are safe in schools.
In pursuit of good results for a better future, these learners have all come here to what is commonly known as study camps. They bath, eat and sleep here. Learners believe that their sacrifices will bear fruit.
Once we give the best of our results and we get enough chance to spend with our teachers.
The local business people are giving us food, are supporting us big time.
This year we must have 100%.
Last week, residents from these areas embarked on a shutdown which turned into violent clashes with police in some areas. Protests were expected to resume today, but the Gauteng Shutdown Coordinating Committee says there's been a change of plans. What are those changes?
So what has been going wrong is we've had all of these shutdowns in our communities. So that means that these communities are disabled. There's no activity happening there, and then we are breaking down our own communities. What we must do is we must take the fight to the powers that be.
We're coming to the powerhouses, and the JSE is the platform of all the powerhouses. We are coming here. This is notice today.
We will consider this and then we will be in touch with you.
If they don't respond to us within 7 days, we will begin to cut what we call the economic blood flow of these organizations.
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor here on SABC News channel. Let's continue with this discussion. Melo, let me just start with you here. By its very nature, the media is there to promote reconciliation, right? And where are we today in terms of that agenda as the media? I mean, you have the issue of land, you have the issue of race, you have the issue of all sorts of things going on in the country right now. The economy that is not growing. Some people are still living in the periphery, for instance. So what role then should the media and does the media play in the agenda of reconciliation today?
I mean, absolutely critical question there, Bongi. For me, I think one of the things that we've sort of like misunderstood, and it has sort of been perpetuated by the media in this country, is a single, suppose, homogenous view of what reconciliation means. And that view of reconciliation tends to be very narrow, in my view, because that reconciliation seems to be centered around this notion of overcoming bigotry and prejudice and all sitting around a campfire and singing Kumbaya together, right? There are other aspects of reconciliation, such as notions of justice, notions of people having access to material well-being that can afford them a life which recommends itself, right? There are all of those other aspects. So I think on the first level, the media in itself needs to broaden this notion of reconciliation and what they understand by it, because the way that the media interprets it and propagates it out into society is the way that informs public discourse and the way people talk about reconciliation. I think on the second level also, there's issues that the media tends to shy away from in terms of talking about them, because those issues tend to be sensitive to certain power brokers, certain corporate interests which may well be funders of the media space, right? I think the media also has a responsibility in that sense to be able to facilitate those conversations, because the moment the media shies away from that role, because if you can talk about it, perhaps something that Amina said around the notion of terms of reference, the media almost in a way sets the terms of reference for public discourse in the country. The moment the media shies away from certain terms of reference on certain issues, then we don't talk about those issues, and those issues tend to bleed out into society in an unstructured manner and in a manner that's not really productive. So I think the media should really take the mantle and start pushing some of these issues and structure the debate around them such that we can have productive discussions that can help us build the country.
And Amina, do you still find that the media today, some in the media, still have handlers outside of their organizations? Because I want us to take a look at this. Former South African Police Major Michael Williamson speaking to the TRC Commission about his role in recruiting journalists and propaganda during the apartheid era.
Early on in your career, and I'm talking about the 70s here, you were removed from your post and you were placed in VETS as part of an infiltration program so that you can gather intelligence of views that were oppositional to the establishment views.
That's correct.
And your moving to Geneva as part of IUEF was part and parcel of that long-term strategy.
That's correct, yes.
And in fact, SANA was set up by IUEF, was it not?
Yes, was funded and...
Funded, yeah. And in that way, with you placed strategically within IUEF, you were legitimately able to gather and get authentic information from journalists who were in SANA, who themselves may have been thinking that they are doing work for a politically correct organization, IUEF.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's called a false flag operation.
In other words, there were journalists who had been recruited or were made to gather intelligence on false flag.
False flag, many.
You'd find somebody within SANA asked by IUEF to go, for instance, to an ANC conference in the Soviet Union, whatever it is, and that person would give as much information about what happened in those conferences as was possible, file it through to IUEF in the belief that it was for a progressive organization, and via you, that information would get to the South African security forces.
Yes, that is correct. That's exactly how it worked. I can give you, for example, one of the last requests that I ever received from SANA. The 19th of November 1979, which was only a few months before I was exposed. There's a telegram from Botswana asking for permission to go to Zimbabwe to cover the Zimbabwean elections, to make contact with Mr. Shancheti and Vusi Make of PAC. Shancheti was a well-known attorney who was involved in defending political prisoners and who had at this time, I believe, had already left South Africa. And then there was a request to for an assignment inside South Africa to look at Inkatha, to visit resettlement areas. And obviously, I would then approve that, give the budget for it, and perhaps give them some further instructions on the type of coverage that they should undertake. And that obviously would be determined by my intelligence tasking from Pretoria.
Yeah. All right. So, I mean, what do you make of this? I mean, that's a major in the police there, whose job it was to recruit journalists to report in a particular way. Do you still find that today?
Well, those days these were handlers, and what was at stake then is probably not very different to what is at stake today, you know, for the hearts and minds and who pays the highest bidder. If you just look at how very respectable Sunday Times journalists have been bought and spun today and used by particular factions, to what end? So it is still happening. Maybe you don't call them handlers, maybe there's another term for it today, but it's very much still happening, and will probably more will still emerge, both in South Africa locally as well as internationally. Most certainly, you know, the media is still powerful, and they can be handled, bought, manipulated.
Did we almost drift back to that era? I mean, I remember the late Professor Kade Asmal, for instance, said he resigned from Parliament, he was no longer a minister there. He resigned because of the secrecy bill, for instance. He was so vehemently opposed to it. Did we almost go back to where we were with bills like those and many others, of course, and how others saw the SABC as even in the new era, saw the SABC as the mouthpiece?
I think it's a question of maybe politicians not understanding the role of the media. Maybe some politicians today still think they need to control the narrative. And I'm saying this too often, using it's becoming a cliche. But I think that is what's at the heart of it, not understanding the role of the media, what its mandate is and how far it can go. But they also understand how powerful the media is, thus the control. I mean, various communication ministers, as you know, they were disastrous, as we all know. And I think the struggle continues, misunderstanding the role of the media. Some of the bills, and I can't comment in a blanket way, but some of the bills, some of the attempted legislation is totally unnecessary, such as the threatened Media Appeals Tribunal, which is not completely off the table, but that's going down, you know, the non-democracy road. And there are other bills as well, such as the one on non-discrimination, which is going to be pushed through Parliament, etc., which tries to legislate what discrimination is. So if you would call me an old white woman, you'd be, you know, it would be discrimination. And if I call you just maybe a man, a bald-headed man, it would be discrimination in terms of how comprehensive this bill is. So some of these bills, I think, is totally unnecessary. We have a great constitution. We have Chapter 9 institutions. Some of them work and others are quite dysfunctional, unfortunately. So I think we need to perhaps consolidate what we have and see what we're not implementing successfully, instead of really tardy, expensive, time-consuming bills, which I believe don't belong there.
All right. We'll come to the newspapers shortly, but very briefly, Melo, then when that trust between the consumers of the news and the producers breaks down completely, what happens?
I mean, absolutely. Then you start having all sorts of individuals then claiming that space, right, and pushing their own narratives, right. I think something that I absolutely agree with Amina on, right, in terms of the role of the newspapers and I suppose the way they acquire news. I think one of the things that we often miss is the fact that often journalists rely on leaks from politicians themselves, right? And often those leaks in themselves are not merely just truth-setting or innocent, right? There's agendas behind those leaks, right? So I think in that space, obviously then it stands to the journalist, I suppose, discretion and the news publication's discretion, right? To be able to filter out what's in the public interest and what is some factional piece of story, right? And then that, I think, is very much difficult for journalists and newspapers to get right. And recently, I think we've shifted to the other end where almost like we pushing factional stories at the sacrificing more objectivity and truth.
Okay, quickly before we run out of time, I want us to look at the newspapers, stories that dominated this past week and stories still to dominate this week ahead of us. It's interesting how the Sunday Times and the City Press got the title exactly the same way, Gigaba Fights Back. So this is the top story that was still going to dominate. What is his strategy here? Have you checked what? How is it going to go?
I haven't checked his strategy, but I think he quite clearly lied under oath, and for that reason, I think there needs to be appropriate action taken. Why that is taking, well, maybe the president is taking his time, but basically that needs to happen. One can't hide behind toing and froing, the public protector recommends, and then, the so-called ethics committee comes in, but actually the NEC needs to take a decision. So I think the NEC needs to be on the same page, maybe to enable, I believe, to enable and to help strengthen the president's hand in terms of taking action as far as Malusi Gigaba's lying under oath is concerned. I mean, his other performance, on the sex front, that's something else. That's something for another story, another day. But not for that reason, but the reason that he lied under oath. Yes. Melo? And there's new sex tapes, rocking the NPA.
Oh yes, yes.
So
yes.
there's so much at stake in terms of the head of the NPA is concerned. I'm not quite sure exactly how that is going to pan out, but there's been a battle for the head of the NPA. What we hope is that we just have someone fair and just, someone that we can look up to, someone that we can depend on. Terrible appointments have been made, and that is such a negative of the past. So hopefully, we'll have someone credible at the head of the NPA.
So what does it for you, Melo, this week ahead?
I mean, just to ride on Amina's coattails there on the Gigaba story, I think for me, one of the more interesting things there is the broader context of the Gigaba story, right? It seems like it's about him lying under oath. It seems it's about him and his sex tape, right? Those are the central issues. But the broader context is the notion of state capture and those who have been labeled as agents of state capture, right, within the ANC governance structures, right? So the falling of Gigaba per se is not just about him. It's about what it portends for all of those people that are sitting in the ANC structures now, right? So I think that for me is going to be very interesting. So it's not going to be a straight cut debate about ethics within the ANC, NEC, but it's also going to be about an issue of survival. The story for me that is very much interesting is one featuring, I think there's a picture of David Cameron where they say that populism is a threat to world stability, right? For me, the context within which I find this populism term coming up within the South African context, right, is debates that are currently happening within the country around the country's monetary policy, right? And those debates have been involving Governor Kganyago and some columnists in Business Day, right? It's been going on now for the past couple of weeks. And then these columnists, basically, they're looking for more looser monetary policy in order to stimulate aggregate demand in the economy. And then Governor Kganyago has been labeling these people as populists. He's been labeling whatever it is that they're saying as economic adventurism, right? And one of the things that people have said is that this notion of calling people populist does not really help advance debate, right? Because at the moment in the country, we are mired in the situation of low economic growth. So when people are proposing alternatives in terms of monetary policy or economic policy or any other type of policy in the country, it does not really help us to be able to just label people as being populist, because this term populist has almost lost meaning, right? Because whenever I don't agree with something, whenever I don't understand something, I just label it as populist. So I think that's something that the media needs to be very much attuned to.
Okay, so the finance minister is in New York, and he goes there and he says SAA needs to be dismantled. He doesn't say it in the country. He did, though, highlight that the SOEs are in shambles and SAA is technically bankrupt. But to go to the US and say it needs to be dismantled,
that's a total no-no. I think he could have expressed it, even if that was his thinking or his wishful thinking, or maybe it was discussed behind the scenes. You don't do something like that on even a local platform, an international platform, if it's not a fact. I think he could have handled it better. He could have handled it differently, and maybe he needs to be told to be a little bit more nuanced. I mean, he's new, and of course, everyone will have their eyes set on him. But talking about finances, the departure, final departure of Tomoyani, the SARS commissioner, I think that will also still go on. That the president got got him to leave. That's a good thing. I think it's been in the cards for a long time, but now he's challenging it. And I think there we have to be very careful, you know, whether the Nugent Commission's recommendation and the President's action, you know, being challenged in the Constitutional Court, I hope it goes the way the public and the people would want it to go.
The President will go ahead and appoint a permanent commissioner there.
Yes, but at the same time, if there's a challenge by Tomoyani in the Constitutional Court, who's paying for that? That's going to be tied up. It is going to compromise. I don't know.
Let's look at the ANC's NEC. You touched on it, earlier on, but it's divided right in the middle. The issue of a VBS, the Integrity Commission says, put these people aside who were found to have their hands in the cookie jar there. And but importantly, the NEC does not really come out strongly and saying, yes, we're doing this, yes, we're doing it with Gredane and Brian Mahlangu here in Gauteng, for instance, at the recommendation of the Provincial Integrity Commission. So is that commission really meaningful to the ANC, or it's one of those commissions really that to say, okay, do it, what you say, we'll deal with it, you know?
I think we need to interrogate and investigate the VBS saga. I think it is a serious blot on our conscience as a nation to let something like that happen, and those who benefited from it, the perpetrators as well, get away with it. So I think it needs to be given very serious attention. I mean, the visuals, and you can just imagine, of those poor pensioners sleeping outside the bank, waiting for their hard-earned pennies. You know, to be refunded to them. I mean, that is heartbreaking. It is so shocking. That, together with life Isidemeni, you know, I don't think it's over.
Okay, that's where we're going to have to leave it here. Thank you very much to both of you. Amina Frense from the IAJ, and of course to you, Melo Akhulejo, who is an independent media analyst. Thank you for watching our show, Media Monitor. We hope that you will join us again, same time and same place next week. From me and the rest of the crew today, good day and stay blessed. Goodbye.